This is a paper that Auguste and I are just starting to work on, and so please, we'll be happy for any input that you have, any suggestions. And Auguste, if please pipe in if I start going astray. So, the guiding question is that uh, can the occurrence of an event be explained by citing its consequences? So we're accustomed to thinking that events explain their consequences, especially in causal explanations, but can we cite a consequence to explain why an event or an occurrence happened? And we're going to argue that yes, you can in two specific cases, in equilibrium systems and in purposive systems. So I have to admit to um, a bit of an ulterior motive here. Probably in this group, there's a great deal of sympathy for the idea that you can explain the occurrence of an event by citing the fact that it realizes an equilibrium. So, but Auguste and I are more interested in teleological explanations, especially in biology. And what we want to do is to kind of leverage the intuition that equilibriums can be used to explain their occurrences and say that teleological explanations have the same structure. And so, by parity, we should accept teleological explanations as an irreducible form of explanation. Okay, so we're grown accustomed now, I hope, in the last number of years to thinking that there are a number of modes of explanations. There are nomological, causal, mathematical, topological, statistical, even more explanations, and we there are sets of arguments for them. And what we want to do is to extract from this battery of arguments a kind of a series of generic good-making features of an explanation and to argue then the same good-making features of an explanation apply to equilibrium and teleological explanations. And the idea then is that the good-making features of explanation have to do with modality. So we're guided by this Aristotelian insight that explanation is a modal phenomenon. Wesley Salmon says that according to this modal conception, scientific explanations do their job by showing that what did happen had to happen. This is an Aristotelian insight. There's also another Aristotelian insight packed in here too, which is what having to happen is a modal phenomenon, a modal concept, and Aristotle shows us that there are many kinds and strengths of modal relations. And the intuition is, alive and well in current accounts of, say, even causal explanation, where Woodward initially tells us explanation is a matter of exhibiting patterns of counterfactual dependence. And this was intended to invoke merely causal dependence, but latterly Woodward and Reitlinger have extended this notion of counterfactual dependence to encompass other modalities. Okay. So what we want to do is to kind of extract from these arguments about why there should be these various modes of explanation, three kinds of modal properties that make for a good explanation. And we've decided to call them these modalities different kind of dimensions of modality, their dependence, sensitivity, and alternativity. They may not be wholly orthogonal. But roughly, they answer three different modal questions. The dependence question answers the question, what does an explanandum depend on? Which is to say, the thing we're explaining, we have to identify some feature of the world that its occurrence depends on. The sensitivity question is, what is the nature of this dependence between explanans and explanandum? And the alternativity question, this is the one I'm having the most difficulty with. I'm willing to take some advice on it or even give it up. But I think there's an important feature of the modal relation of an explanation that a good explanation tells us what is the pattern of dependence between explanandum and other counterfactual or factual or actual facts. Okay, so let's look at these three dimensions of modal explanation in turn. So dependence starts with Woodward's W question that he outlines in his 2003 book and laterally in 2018. And initially, Woodward says an explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see what sort of difference it would have made for the explanand if the factors cited in explanans had been different in various ways. And of course, this is a very powerful intuition. It's one we endorse, but as it's expressed, it may be a little bit too coarse because not every factor that makes a difference might enter into an explanation. So take the case of contrastive explanations. Contrastivists say that when we give an explanation of some occurrence P, we're not just answering the question why P, we're answering the question why P rather than some other relevant alternatives. And so for instance, we want to answer the question, why does some individual O, say a human being, have brown eyes? And what we do is we set up a contrast class, ways things might relevantly have been. So the human's eyes could be green or blue or hazel or whatever. And then the explanation then is the factor that makes the difference, distinguishes between the actual occurrence, O1 in this case, and other relevant ways things might have been. And so we don't find in this explanation, say, statements about the initial conditions at the origin of the universe, or the conditions that were conducive to the invasion of land by tetrapod vertebrates in the Devonian. Why not? Because these are difference makers. Had things been different in respect of these factors, we would not have had a person with brown eyes. They don't pick out the differences that make the relevant differences. So if we take it that there's a contrastive element in explanation, then we want our dependence to be a relation of relevant dependence. So here's a kind of amendment to the dependence condition. An explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see what sort of difference it would have made for the explanandum if the factors in the explanans had been relevantly different, right? So notice this notion of dependence is cashed out in terms of difference, what difference it would make to the explanans had things been different. But there's also an element of autonomy in this dependence. So we see this quite clearly in explanations where the macro state is used in an explanation and the micro state isn't. And in these cases, that seems to occur because the macro state has a certain degree of modal autonomy. Macro state of a system has a degree of modal autonomy over the microstate of the system. There seems to be a causal dependence. The microstate causes or realizes the macrostate, but the autonomy is a sort of taxonomic autonomy. Samenesses and differences in macrostate don't map onto samenesses and differences in microstate. And we get these, and it's the macrostate, samenesses and differences in macrostate that figure in the explanations. And we see this all over the place in renormalization group explanations, university class explanations, optimality explanations. So let's take a very, very simple example of optimality explanations. So in the 70s, Jeff Parker, an evolutionary biologist, wanted to model the optimal time that a dung fly should take in copulating. So copulation here is a trade-off between the benefits of mating and the opportunity costs of guarding a mate. So the idea is that female dung flies mate with many, many males, and males search out the females and they copulate with them, and then they guard the females against subsequent copulations. Now, subsequent copulations can account for, say, maybe 80% of the fertilization. So there's a premium on mates guarding against the females, and that's a cost to their reproductive opportunities. There's also a benefit to had by searching out other males. And Parker wanted to know, so what's the optimum time that a male who copulates with a female should spend guarding? And he did the fitness calculus, and he predicted that the optimum time should be around 36 minutes. And then it did a whole bunch of observations in the field of dung fly matings, and the observed mating time came reasonably close. Okay, so here the idea is that these observations are made over an enormous range of different conditions in the field, but they all have something in common. What they have in common is that the optimal time spent guarding is the same in each case, right? So our dependence condition ought to reflect this. So we think here's another amendment to a dependence is that an explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see what would have to be the same in order for the explanandum to have been relevantly the same. And in this case, what has to be the same is the optimal time. Okay, so here's our dependence modality that for an explanation. An explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see what sort of difference it would have made for the explanandum. Factors cited in the exponans had been relevantly different, and what would have to be the same for the explanandum to be relevantly the same. Okay. So the sameness and differences of exponand state figure in this dependence between exponans and explanandum, but we also should think that there are different kinds of dependence, right? So the explanations of why no one has successfully crossed the bridges of Königsberg. Well, every time somebody's failed, let's suppose they failed, and these failures may have various causes. They might have run out of shoe leather, or their visa expired, or they got tired, or something like that, right? But none of these causes is the explanation of the failure. The explanation of because none of them captures the right kind of dependence. The explanation of the failure has to do with the fact that, given the topology of the bridges of Königsberg, there is no Euler path through the bridges. So there's no way to, as a matter of topological necessity, there's no way to cross the bridges exactly once. And so Mark Lang tells us, well, this is a kind of mathematical dependence, right? And it's this mathematical dependence that figures in our explanation. So Lang says the facts doing explaining are modally stronger than ordinary causal laws, since they concern the framework of any possible causal relation. And so this is a mathematical dependence, and he says mathematical explanation works by showing how the explanandum arises from the framework that any possible causal structure must inhabit. Okay, so there's a strong form of modal dependence, stronger than, or it's different from causal dependence, it's mathematical dependence. Okay. So the sensitivity modality tells us that an explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see in what sense of depends the explanandum depends on the explanans. And we should at least, I hope, be willing to accept that there's a variety of modal dependencies, causal, nomic, mathematical, logical. There must be logical explanations, statistical, and we hope to argue that there are more. And the third modality is alternativity. And this is the one I'm having the most difficulty with. So I'm happy to take advice on it or even give it up if you press me on it. But it's implicit in lots of the arguments for various modes of explanation. So let's see if we can illuminate this a little bit. Here's a question that's been going around in philosophy, biology for a while. Does natural selection explain of an individual organism why it has the traits it has? And there are two views on this. The positive view says yes, and the negative view says no. So let's look at this. Suppose we have some situation like this. This is a lineage. It starts off with an ancestor, O0, who is white and has two offsprings. And in one lineage, the one leading to O2, there's a mutation. And then there's, so the white turns to yellow. And then there's selection for yellow, and yellow increases in the population. And one of the individuals that produces O5, who is yellow, and we want to know why is O5 yellow. Okay, so the negative view says, look, natural selection plays no role in explaining this phenomenon. Why? Because we can vary the history of natural selection while holding the history of mutation and inheritance constant, and O5 is still yellow. So mutation and inheritance is all that matters here. And by the same token, we can vary the history of mutation and inheritance, and it doesn't matter what we do with selection. And that varying the history of mutation and inheritance varies the fact of O5 being yellow. And so, according to the negative view, it's only mutation and inheritance that explains why an individual has the trait it has. Natural selection is no part of this explanation. The positive view says, well, no, this is a really bad argument because the because the positive view, selection can make a difference. If selection had been relatively different, relevantly different, which is to say, had selection been stringent enough to make it the case that O5's ancestors didn't reproduce, then O5 wouldn't exist at all. And not existing is a very good way of not being yellow. And so the history of selection makes a difference here. So having propounded one of these arguments, both of these arguments appeal to counterfactual dependence, and I put forward one of them, and I'm willing to admit they're both really bad arguments. But the idea here is that counterfactual dependence alone isn't going to settle the issue. Well, maybe we can settle the issue by saying, well, what are the relevant counterfactuals here? And there's a dispute about what counts as a relevant alternative here. And according to the positive view, the non-existence of O5 is a relevant alternative. And according to the negative view, it isn't. And there doesn't seem to be any way to resolve this question. And so we reach a kind of impasse here. But it seems to me that there's a very good reason for arguing for the negative view that doesn't have to do with dependence, but it has to do with some other factor. So one thing we know about inheritance and development is traits can vary independently. So O5 being yellow is modally independent of it being, say, having some other trait, being tall or short, fast or slow, round or square, and we can vary the history of mutation and inheritance vis-a-vis being yellow, but leave unchanged the inheritance of other traits. Okay, and so so the history of mutation and development can, as it were, recognize or honor the modal independence of one trait against another. But the only way we can change things with respect to O5 being yellow by manipulating natural selection is to make it the case that O5 doesn't exist at all. And that misrepresents the modal, because if O5 wasn't yellow, didn't exist at all, O5 wouldn't be yellow, but it wouldn't either be fast or slow, tall or short, round or square. So manipulating natural selection or very natural selection misrepresents the degree to which one character is modally independent of other characters. And so for this reason, it seems to me that the selection, inheritance and development recognizes this modal independence between characters. It makes it a better explanation. So let's take another example, right? So there are two hypotheses around about what caused the mass extinction of the Cretaceous-Paleogene border 66 million years ago. So one hypothesis says, oh, the mass extinction was caused by an asteroid, and the other says it's caused by volcanism. Now, both these things were going on at the same time. And those who argue for the asteroid impact say, look, at the same time, there is this impact crater and there's this massive iridium spike. And that can only be explained by a massive asteroid. And those who favor the Deccan Traps volcanism hypothesis say, well, there is this massive mercury fallout in sediments right at that time, and that can only have been caused by volcanism. Okay, so notice I don't know how to resolve this debate, but notice what the form of the argument here is. Each of the arguments is citing some other fact other than mass extinction and saying that their hypothesis makes the coincidence of mass extinction with this other event explainable, right? So the Titular hypothesis explains the co-occurrence of the iridium spike and the impact crater with the mass extinction. The Deccan Traps hypothesis explains the co-occurrence of the mercury fallout with the mass extinction. So each hypothesis claims to be the best explanation on account of some modal relation of the explanandum to some other fact. So this idea of this modal relation of the explanandum to other facts being relevant to the assessment of the goodness of an explanation is this idea of alternativity. So an explanation according to alternativity ought to be such that it enables us to see what would be the same or different in respect of other facts, actual or counterfactual, if things had been different in various ways. And in fact, there's an element of alternativity kind of actively in use or implicitly in use in lots of arguments about the goodness of explanations. So think of Woodward's claims about causal relations, causes explaining their effects in virtue of there being an invariance relation that holds between them. So he says at a minimum, such generalizations must be in causal generalizations must be invariant in the sense that they will continue to hold under some range of interventions on factors cited in the explanans. Basically, what he's saying here is when we have a causal model that represents some variable x as the cause of some variable y, invariance tells us if the value of x had been different, then the value of y would differ in a systematic way. So invariance isn't telling us what has to be this different for y to be different, or isn't telling us what has to be the same for y to be the same. It's telling us something about counterfactual situations, right? It tells us that a causal invariance relation tells us what a set of cause-effect dyads, say x and y, have in common such that had one not occurred, then one member of the set had not occurred, then another member of the set would have occurred. And I think this is an instance of alternativity, and it's kind of implicit in our accounts of what makes for a good explanation. Okay. So here are three kind of modalities, three kinds of modal questions that we could expect a good explanation to answer. The dependence question, what does the exponent depend on? The sensitivity question, what is the nature of the dependence? And the alternativity question, what is the pattern of dependence between explanans and other actual or counterfactual facts? So we can think of explanation as a kind of modality matching. So a good explanation will answer all these questions. And each of the cases we've run through, we've used them to motivate one of these three criteria. But in every case, the good explanation meets all these three criteria. And so as any event will have any number of modal relations, we can expect that any event will be susceptible to a number of multiple explanations, as it were, at the same time. So if modality matching then is our kind of criterion of a good explanation, now we get to ask a couple of questions, like, could the consequences of an event meet these modal conditions? If so, we could use the consequences of an event to explain its occurrence. So let's take an example here. It's a very simple equilibrium case example. So R.A. Fisher argued that in a panmictic population, which is to say a population where basically every mating is as probable as any other, we should expect that the population should move to a 50-50 sex ratio of males and females and stay there. This is an equilibrium, a stable equilibrium. And he used the following argument. So he says, like, suppose there's a disparity between males and females, then the minority sex will have more per capita mating opportunities than the majority will. So their fitness will be higher. And so suppose then a population it varies in the propensity of some parent to produce males versus females. So some produce more males, some produce more females. Individuals who produce an uneven sex ratio of males and female offspring will have higher fitness if the sex they produce more of is in the minority. And so if that's the case, then the minority sex will increase, and eventually a population will move towards a 50-50 sex ratio. Okay, so we can explain why a particular population took this trajectory by citing the fact that the consequence is a stable equilibrium. That's Fisher's argument. Okay, so Elliott Sober brought this to our attention, and what he wanted to tell us is that this is not a causal explanation. So Elliott says, whatever the actual initial sex ratio had been, the selection pressures that would have resulted would have moved the population to its equilibrium state, where causal explanation shows how the event to be explained was in fact produced equilibrium explanation shows how the event would have occurred regardless of which variety of causal scenarios actually transpired. So Elliot, as I say, is arguing here that this is a non-causal explanation, but he isn't telling us what it is about the the stable equilibrium state that actually makes it capable of explaining, if it is capable of explaining. Okay. Well, it seems that the equilibrium state, the 50-50 sex ratio equilibrium state of a trajectory here, has all the modal features that make for a good explanation. This certainly exemplifies dependence. Remember that dependence is an explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see what sort of difference it would have made for the exponandum if the factors cited in exponans had been relevantly different, and what would have to be the same for the exponandum to be relevantly the same. So had the equilibrium state been different, the trajectory would have been different. And this is easy to show. So in non-panmictic populations where there's, say, a great deal of polygamy, you expect that the equilibrium sex ratio to be different, right? So you can actually manipulate a population to make it the case that a different equilibrium state holds, and then you get different mating trajectories. By trajectories here, I just mean sequences of matings and births. It also has meets the autonomy condition, had the equilibrium state. So given any range of trajectories, sequences of matings and birth, had the equilibrium state been the same, the trajectory would have been relevantly the same. That is to say, it would have resulted in a 50-50 sex ratio. It seems to meet the claim of sensitivity in the sense that it shows us what kind of dependence we're dealing with here. So remember that the sensitivity requirement tells us that an explanation ought to be such that enables us to see in what sense of depends the exponandum depends on the exponand. So Andrei Ariev and Colin Rice and Yashar Roa tell us this is a kind of statistical dependence. They use Ian Hacking's notion of an autonomous statistical explanation. They say here's how's the explanation works. We assume the population conforms to the properties of an idealized statistical distribution, and then we deduce the exponandum from the statistical regularities that govern those statistical distributions. So really what this distribution consists in is just this, that if you take the complete phase space of this population, all the possible trajectories of matings and births, well, the measure of those trajectories that end up in a 50-50 sex ratio is much, much greater than the measure of those trajectories that end up in a non-50-50 ratio. So as a matter of what statistical necessity, statistical dependence, the trajectories are going to be predominantly 50-50 trajectories. So going back to Sober here, he says equilibrium explanation shows us how the event would have occurred regardless of which variety of causal scenarios actually transpired. And this modality here would have occurred is a modality of statistical dependence. Okay, so equilibria explanations meet this kind of sensitivity requirement. And they also have a form of invariance. They meet the alternativity requirement as well, which is, as you recall, that an explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see what would be the same or different in respect of other facts if things had been different in various ways. So any trajectory other than the actual one would have resulted in the equilibrium state. So being an equilibrium state gives us something like an invariance relation. Being an equilibrium state tells us what the members of a set of trajectories have in common, such that had one not occurred, then another member of the same set would have occurred. They are 50-50 equilibrium state trajectories. Okay. So if that's right, then, if this equilibrium state kind of meets the requirements on a good explanation, then equilibrium states can explain their trajectories, right? The 50-50 sex ratio is a consequence of a trajectory. a sequence of mating and birth, and this consequence explains a really important character of the trajectory, and it does so by meeting these modal requirements. The trajectory is modally related to its consequence in the right way, in the way of dependence, sensitivity, and alternativity. So the claim then is, if these are the good-making features of an explanation, then consequences can instantiate those features, particularly when we have an equilibrium system. So how's the time here? It's okay. Um, so let's have another example. Teleological explanations. This is the more tendentious one, and this is the one I think that Auguste and I are most interested in, right? So a teleological explanation explains an activity or a structure by citing the goal it subserves. In this case, the goal it subserves is a consequence of the activities of the system, right? And so this looks backwards. But we have teleological explanations in action theory. So we explain why agents do what they do because of their goals. We have this in behavior, excuse me, where we don't expect that there's rational deliberation, but organisms act according to their goals. We have teleological explanations in artifacts, and crucially, increasingly, it's being recognized that we have teleological explanations in evolutionary biology. Organisms are taken to be purposive systems, and their being purposive makes a difference to the dynamics of evolution. Their being purposive is manifested in the plasticity of in development, in biased evolutionary innovation, and in adaptive inheritance. And in each of these cases, organisms respond to their circumstances and produce an output. And these outputs are explained, like say a new developmental trajectory, or developmental innovation, or adaptive inheritance. And these features of organisms are explained by some crucial feature of their effect, which is to say there are all ways that the organism has of maintaining viability. Maintaining viability here is a goal. So teleological explanations seem to be implicitly, at least, alive and well in much of evolutionary developmental biology. But the problem is that there's a general thought that you can't explain an event by citing its goals. Okay. One reason might be thought that goals aren't natural states. Goals are maybe projections or something like that. Nothing in the world has no event in the world has the property of being a goal. Well, on a certain view of what it is to be a goal, goals are perfectly natural states. They are the ends of goal-directed processes, and goal-directed processes or goal-directedness is empirically observable. You can see it in the dynamics of a goal-directed system. In particular, the concept of a goal on one account gets cashed out in terms of a cluster of interrelated concepts: goal, affordance, and repertoire. So a goal is a state of affairs that a system actively attains or maintains by marshalling elements of its repertoire in response to its affordances. And a repertoire is a set of behaviors, an element of which the agent can actuate in pursuit of its goals in responses to its affordances. And an affordance is an impediment to or an opportunity for the pursuit of an agent's goals given its circumstances. So the claim here is that we can see goal directedness, and the goal and a goal is just the end of a goal directed process. So let's take an example. Here's C. elegans, this little worm. It's got 200 cells, a tiny little thing, and it can behave in various ways. So it can move towards a nutrient, or it can avoid a desiccant. It won't cross a desiccating surface, right? So it's got this repertoire. It can go, it can move towards something that's good for it. It can avoid something that's bad for it. And it has a kind of pliable repertoire. If the desiccant, say, is between the worm and the nutrient, it won't cross the desiccant to get the goal. Unless, of course, it's really hungry, or the desiccant isn't that severe, or the payoff to inserting the nutrient is really good. It will cross the desiccant surface in order to get to the nutrient. So it has a range of goals and it has a range of it has a repertoire of activities, and we explain the activities of this C. elegans in terms of its goals. Okay, so this looks like a teleological explanation. We explain the C. elegans goal of reaching the nutrient explains its activity. And this goal then that explains the activity, that is the consequence of the activity, seems to meet the requirements of a good-making explanation. It meets the conditions of dependence, which recall is that an explanation ought to be such that enables us to see what sort of difference it would have made for the explanandum if the factors cited in the explanans had been relevantly different, and what would have to be the same for the explanandum to be relevantly the same. So had the goal been different in this case, the activity would have been different. Had the goal of the C. elegans have been to avoid the desiccant, it would have done different behaviors. Okay. But had the goal been the same and the conditions been different, the activity would have been relevantly the same, right? If the sugar source was nutrient source was somewhere else, the C. elegans would have moved it towards it, right? In a different direction rather than the direction it actually moved in. So the goal meets the dependence conditions. The goal also meets a certain, really specific kind, or picks out a specific kind of modal dependence, right? It meets the sensitivity conditions in a unique way. So remember, the sensitivity condition is that an explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see in what sense it depends. The explanandum depends on the explanans. So the relation between an end and its means, or a goal and its means, is modal, which is to say, we've just seen that it supports these counterfactuals. Had the goal been the same, the activity would have been relevantly the same. Had the goal been different, the activity would have been different. So what's the form of this modality? So Aristotle calls this hypothetical necessity. Goals necessitate the means to their fulfillment. Goals can't be fulfilled unless the means to their fulfillment are actuated. And because of this, then, this modal relation between goals and their means induces a kind of normative set of conditions, right? It sets up conditions of appropriateness and inappropriateness. So you can judge an activity as appropriate to the bringing about of its ends, or inappropriate to its ends. So what we have then, this kind of modal relation, is a kind of natural normative relation, right? So we explain an activity by citing the goals, by showing that under the circumstances, given the goals, that's what the agent ought to have done. And when we understand a teleological explanation, we understand this normative dimension, which is to say, we understand an action or a structure teleologically when we understand what the agent ought to do. Okay, this is a we claim this is a natural normative relation, but it's a modal relation, but it's a very different modal relation from causal modality, or logical modality, or statistical modality. And for this reason, teleological explanations have a certain autonomy. They can't be reduced to causal explanations, which is the standard way of trying to deal with teleological explanations. And it also gives us this kind of alternativity dimension, which recall is an explanation ought to be such that it enables us to see what would be the same or different in respect of other facts if things had been different in various ways. So just as causes and their effects in an invariance relation, goals and their means do as well. So the invariance relation between goals and means tells us if other conditions had been different, the activity would have been different, but in a systematic way. It would have been an activity that produced the goals. So being conducive to a goal state tells us what a set of actions have in common, such that had one not occurred, then another member of the same set would have occurred. This is the same kind of form as an invariance relation. And if that's the case, just as equilibrium states can explain the occurrence of their trajectories, then goals can explain the occurrence of their means. So the attainment of nutrients in this case is a consequence of a goal-directed activity, and the consequence can explain the activity. And the consequence can explain the activity precisely because we claim it instantiates the right kind of modal relation between the goal and the means to its occurrence. Specifically, the goal-directed activity is modally related to the consequence in the right way by dependence, sensitivity, and alternativity. Okay. So there we have another instance of a consequence explanation, another instance in which an effect it instantiates a certain modal dependence on the events that cause it, and the dependence answers these questions. The citing the effect answers questions. What does the explanandum depend on? What is the nature of the dependence? And what is the pattern of dependence between explanandum and other actual factual facts? Okay. So wrapping up then, the claim then is explanation is a kind of modality matching. The best explanation is an explanation that picks out an explanans that that shows the modal properties of the explanandum that we're interested in, right? That best matches those. And when we're deciding between two alternative competing explanations of an explanandum, we do this by picking the explanation that optimally matches the modal properties we think are salient. So an event or occurrence may instantiate multiple explanatory modal relations at once. So we should expect that there's explanatory pluralism to be had. So you can always explain an effect by citing an event by citing its causes, but that doesn't preclude there being other useful, autonomous, and completely satisfactory explanations. In particular, in certain cases, consequences can instantiate the explanatory modal relations with their occurrences. And in these cases, we can cite the consequences of an occurrence as part of the explanation of why it occurs. And in particular, this form of consequence explanation holds for two kinds of systems: equilibrium systems and purposive systems. These are different kinds of explanations. They're autonomous explanations, but they have the same general modal form. And as a result, consequences can explain. And we just have some thank yous to say. I want to make the point that I work on the lands of indigenous North American persons that who and are working there is covered by treaties and by agreements with these indigenous nations, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. Thank you very much. Auguste and I will be happy to entertain any questions.
I don't know if you can hear, but there's a big round of applause.
Yes, I can hear. Yes.
Okay.
I can anyway.
Am
I messing things up here? Okay.
You can hear?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. I'm going to take questions now for the Q&A. First, are you doing the mic loop? Okay. We're just setting up
I
the
think
mic.
we'll need the mic, yeah.
Okay, first on the list is Wayne, then I have Eugene. Any other questions? Raise your hand. I'll keep a list. All right.
Thank you for that. This is really fascinating. I'd like to hear more about the sense in which consequences can explain, and maybe I can explain why I'm still a little uncertain by reference to your actually instead of the C elegans, I actually don't have any idea what sort of sensory apparatus they have. So if you don't mind, can we change the example to be a rat? So
Sure.
we've got a hungry rat that's given choice of two channels to go on, one of which has food, the other that the rat likes, and the other one doesn't. And it takes one or the other, and you might say, well, the reason it went down the one where the food is because of the effect, the consequence it gets food. I would still ask, well, how did it know the food is there? Like, in a situation where it can see or smell the food, I can see that being an explanation. But in a situation where the rat can't see or smell the food, this consequence is still there.
Hmm.
I don't think the consequence would actually explain the rat's behavior. And you can also make it, imagine situations where in one direction it looks like there's food, or you put a false smell trail so it looks and smells like there's food in one direction, and the food is actually on the right. I would expect actually the rat to go to the place where it looks and smells like food rather than where the actual food is, and then the consequence is the rat goes hungry. So it seems to me that if the rat or the CL, goes towards the food, the explanation isn't the consequence. The explanation is the rat wants food, and it's got sensory indications that's where the food is. So, but then it's not the consequence down the road that I'm invoking that as an explanation.
Okay, good, thanks. I'll have a shot at this, and I'll invite August to help out if he wants to. So yeah, I mean that's certainly right that if the consequence, as it were, the food isn't in some way salient to the rat or the organism, it's not going to be capable of responding. That's exactly right. And so C. elegans detects nutrients, and moves up a gradient. That's exactly right. That's a condition for this explanation to hold. And so one might be tempted to say then, oh, all that's going on here is this kind of causal interaction between, say, traces of the food and the sensory system of the worm or the rat, and some causal interaction, and then it just causes this motor response, and that's fine. And like we're not denying that, right? But at the end of your question, you said, well, all that's going on is that the rat wants food, and then it's kind of implementing these mechanisms that gets the food. But there, you're appealing to the goal, the wanting the food. The goal, wanting food is having the goal of getting food, right? And so, see, even in this case, it looks like the goal is indispensable to the explanation, or at least it augments the causal explanation that you give of the interaction of the trace of the nutrients with the organism's motor system, right? So even there, so if you could eliminate the claim about wanting food, and that being the goal rather than some other goal, say avoiding desiccation, and give a complete full explanation that couldn't be augmented by that, well, then I'd be happy to go along with that. But I think we implicitly invoke goals really easily all the time. And as I said, this is becoming such an issue in evolutionary biology because plasticity, development and innovation are actually being invoked now as major features in the causation of evolution.
Yeah,
August, do you have anything? Sorry.
I agree entirely, and I certainly don't think that when you're dealing with agents capable of having goals, we should try to eliminate talk of goals. Right?
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think what I wanted to say is I wanted to distinguish between the goal and the consequence, because
Uh-huh.
the rat has the goal of getting food. We've got, that's why I said at the very beginning, it's a hungry rat. The rat wants food, right? Now, if the rat is fooled and it looks like and smells like there's food down one uh, down channel A, but it's not there, rat still has the goal of getting food, and that goal is part of the explanation why it goes down channel A, but actually getting food is not a consequence of that choice.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, that's a kind of strange feature of teleological explanations that they have degenerate cases. And but in the paradigm case, teleological explanations seem to work by citing the goal, and you understand why why the agent did what it did by citing the success conditions. So the success conditions are a consequence of the activities, but they're not a necessary consequence. I think that's right. So we just have to make a special case for degenerate case teleological explanations.
Okay, Auguste, do you have?
Auguste, you have anything to?
Yeah, I think maybe I hope this helps that maybe what you're getting at is that a goal-directed activity will bring about lots of consequences, and some of them might just be completely arbitrary or just results of the goal-directed activity itself. So, in these explanations, what we care about is the aspects of the consequence that are the goal. But maybe I didn't understand exactly what the point was. Yeah.
They're very different. That's what I'm saying. I have
Mhm.
goals. Most of them will not be consequences of my actions.
Mhm. Yeah. So these the aspect that explains, and of course there are degenerative cases, will be the goals.
Okay. Next question. We're moving on to Eugene.
Thanks for the talk. It's very interesting. I don't know much about this stuff of explanation, but I had something I wanted to clarify. Maybe it's not much of a big question. I guess I was saying in the case of equilibrium, so I was working on the equilibrium case, and I guess from where I work on like thermodynamics. Uh, in the case of equilibrium, like you might have thought like, well, before we learned about statistical mechanics, we have thought, well, it's a pretty good equilibrium explanation that systems like a gas or a box of gas will equilibrate. Like there's this kind of necessity they're talking about in the beginning. But then later on, we refine that modality, and nowadays we wouldn't say all initial states lead to will equilibrate to the final equilibrium state, right? So the would have occurred condition seem to be a bit too strong. I was wondering whether I don't think it matters for your account, but probably in the case of equilibrium, it doesn't have to be a strong necessity that would have like had the equilibrium state been the same, then the outcomes would have been then everything else would have been the same because there could be equilibrium state that stays the same, but the initial conditions are just so weird that systems don't actually approach there. Right. So I was wondering whether there's like a refinement of this kind of account of the equilibrium side where the modality is like slightly weakened, say like typical initial conditions lead to the kind of equilibrium we're talking about. Then like as a corollary of that kind of thought, I was thinking, well, we learned about that because of causal considerations, and I was wondering whether there's kind of a sense in which the equilibrium explanation, good as it is, and I like the idea that it works in some cases, we really only learn the scope of it by appealing to causal explanations or something more fundamental to understand the scope of this equilibrium explanations. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
Super, thank you. So the first part of the question, yeah, I completely agree with it. This idea that Salmon has of modal explanations being showing that it had to happen, that's very crude. And then the use of these counterfactuals is kind of, it's open to some refinement, right? But I think the idea then is like once you understand the nature, the answer the sensitivity question, once you understand the nature of the modal dependence, then you can understand the scope of the regularity that you're appealing to when you give this explanation. That's exactly right. Yeah. So in the case of the 50-50 sex ratio, actually it holds under kind of just restricted conditions. So a lot of basic biological facts have to be in place for the 50-50 sex ratio to be operative. But when they are, the vast preponderance of those mating trajectories will end up in 50-50.
Okay.
And the second one, yes, um, uh, um, there's no brief here against causal explanations as such. And in fact, the various modes of explanations, though they're autonomous, can, I think, really kind of inform one another about, say, the scope of the application of the explanation. I think that's exactly right.
Further questions?
August, please feel free to pile in here.
You can always just join August. Yeah. Next question, Aditya.
Thank you. Would you think that the explanation we have in such cases is epistemic in some sense? And so it's not an explanation really. It's an agent justifying, once they have the consequence, as to why, in their best belief, something should happen. So, for example, a gas approaching a sort of equilibrium, and I ask the question, I can ask two questions. One question could be, what justifies this state of equilibrium as a state of equilibrium? And I can give an answer, it's stationary, it's stable, so forth. If I ask the question, what explains this approach to equilibrium? And then the answer could be a bit different. Then I cannot use the consequence to justify the gas's approach. This has to be causal, has to be dynamical, much more detailed. In the first case, the explanation appeals to, either an epistemic fact that we observe equilibrium in many different cases in a wide variety of settings, or some principle, which could be, I don't know, it could be typicality, algorithmicity, and so forth. But so far we don't have a story as to why do individual systems approach equilibrium, in a sense of having an explanation of it. And so I wonder, to what extent is your account an account of epistemic version of explanations in the sense of justifications and not explanations really. And I disagree with Mark Lung's account entirely. I've worked on this topic. I have a paper on this. Mark responded to it, and I'm working in response to it. And I don't think the account of necessities is that straightforward. Only when you hold, certain initial contingent conditions, and you perfectly craft your explanandum, then you get some kinds of explanations that looks like, oh, it's doing some work, but the work is equally being done by the initial boundary conditions, contingent conditions. So it's also the way you solve the problem. Like Wayne's that example, or your example of the insect, and it makes a big difference to the explanation that you eventually end up with in the final case. Thanks. Hope this is clear and I was not ambiguous in the question.
Okay, thank you. So, so the first part of your question, I have like two answers to. And one is, look, on any account of what one is doing, or what the role of explanation is, we ought to be able to uh, allow a multiplicity of modal relations in our explanation. So that holds for if you take an epistemic conception of explanation, or if you take a more metaphysically laden conception of explanation. That's the first answer. The second answer is that I tend to think that explanation is factive, that an explanation is only a good one if the exponans is a fact in the world, or close to a fact. And so so then it's incumbent on somebody like me then to think that these modal relations are real relations in the world, and that goals are real states, and that equilibrium states are real. Being an equilibrium state is a real fact about the state of a system, and that these can figure in these explanations. That's the answer to the first question. I think the second question is that, yeah, I mean, I think this same worry came up in Eugene's question. These systems that behave in these ways are constrained, and we understand the dynamics a lot by understanding the domain of constraints within which they operate in these well-behaved ways. I don't think that makes it the case that in the cases that work, we can't appeal to consequences to explain, to give genuine explanations. It's just that we have to understand that these operate over a certain scope or constrained in certain ways. Is that, I'm not entirely sure that I got the second part of your question, but
To understand the word constraint a bit in your framing, is the constraint a physical constraint? Is it an epistemic constraint? Because if you frame a question in a certain way,
I see.
it's an
Well, there again, I mean, in my case, these must be physical constraints, right? So the agent must be capable of behaving in certain ways. It must have a repertoire. It must have the capacities to respond to the affordances of its circumstances in certain ways. And these are specific constraints on being an agent, right? But those are physical constraints. Auguste?
I don't think I have that much to add. I guess we do have an epistemic view of explanation in the sense that we think there's lots of different ways of framing a question about a given system. With the sex ratio case, there's lots of variants of sort of the question that you could ask. Could ask, like, why is the system taking this trajectory? Why do we see the pervasiveness of this, one-to-one sex ratio across very different populations? Why is the system at this point, right? So of this one system, there's a lot of slightly sort of variant questions we could ask. And each of them you might think might appeal to some kind of equilibrium explanation, but only in some cases might it actually be a consequence explanation in the sense that the equilibrium point is doing the explaining, right? So depending on how exactly you ask your question, you'll have a slightly different sort of answer. And I think our claim is that, or all that we want to defend is to say that in certain cases, you genuinely get some explanatory value out of explaining a system, an equilibrium system, in terms of the equilibrium point. And that's not to say that it is the best explanation or that it's better than the others. The point is just to say that you lose some of the modal information, some of sort of just part of the explanation if you don't get the answer in this way in this particular context. That's, I think, all that we're saying. I hope Denis agrees with that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in a last question abusing chair's privilege before we wrap up. Again, I want to thank you for the talk. I thought it was excellent, very, very clear. I have a question that is in part motivated by a question that came up repeatedly in the workshop in the examples that we considered in physics, and I suppose also in economics, actually, which was and it connects to Eugene's question, I think, about how causal explanations and equilibrium explanations interact on a pluralist account. So I guess we talked a lot about equilibrium models or equilibrium state descriptions as idealizations, right? So we model systems that are never in full equilibrium, and partially that is because we want to leverage those to learn new details about the systems in the long run, right? So when you were talking about, when you were like lining out the conditions, model conditions for explanation, you're describing the importance of the reference class selections of counter possibilities. I was thinking, interesting. Perhaps we can, if equilibrium explanations depend on those the contrast class, and the contrast class itself is in some sense causally explained or explained in reference to other theoretical knowledge, I'd be really curious to know whether in those examples that you've considered in biology, you have an interesting story to tell as to how over time, as our understanding of the contrast class grows, we revise our initial equilibrium models such that equilibrium explanations maybe have this diachronic function in increasing our knowledge about a system over time. Is this something you observe? Is there perhaps an idealization, de-idealization story to tell? I'd be very curious to hear any thoughts you have on that. Yeah.
Oh, good question. I'm gonna need to think a bit. Auguste, you got anything on this for now?
No, nothing specific. I think there probably is a story to be told, just like the one you described. I would be really surprised if there isn't. I guess I just off the top of my head can't think of how exactly that has happened historically or might happen. But yes, I have no doubts that that's probably the case.
So this might be a slightly tendentious answer, but given the structure of Fisher's equilibrium explanation and this notion that like the trajectories of a population had kind of there's a statistical dependence between the end and the trajectories of a population. You might think that every natural selection explanation has that same form. Some of us think that the natural selection explanations are a form of statistical explanation, and they conform roughly to this Fisher form. And if that's the case, then you might expect that, well, there's all sorts of stuff that goes on in biology that could deflect the population from the attainment of its equilibrium. So linkage disequilibrium and mutation rates or non-random mutation or differential migration or something like that, right? So these are all factors that could, as it were, deflect the population from the expected outcome given the statistical irregularities. And so you could use that kind of diversion from the outcome to as an understanding of how factors other than, say, natural selection could figure into the dynamics of populations. And that happens all the time. I don't know if that would be an instance of the kind of leveraging the idealization to understand more about the causal details, but that's just the first pass answer.
Super helpful. Yeah, I think it would. Yeah, I mean, I'd have to think about it more, but it's super helpful.